It's Wednesday, May 25th, 2016, and this is KBIA's Views of the News. Our weekly roundtable on media behaviors comes to you from the Futures Lab studio at the Reynolds Journalism Institute. I'm Amy Simons, and here with me are my colleagues Mike McKean and Earnest Perry. On our program this week, more back and forth between Tribune and Gannett. This is getting kind of goofy. A raised offer, a decline of that offer, and a new investor offering a $70 million cash infusion. We'll catch you up on what's going on there. St. Louis County drops the charges against 2 journalists arrested for trespassing while covering the unrest in Ferguson, that happening almost 2 years ago. And a tweet from inside the Huffington Post editorial boardroom, a room full of women, was supposed to show how far they'd come, but that photo blew up in their face big time. We'll explain what happened. And there's a lot more that hopefully we will get to before this half hour's up. But we're going to start with the Washington Post poll that came out a few days ago. It showed 9 out of 10 Native Americans support the use of the name Redskins for the Washington NFL franchise. The paper commissioned the poll. It was conducted over 5 months, ending in April, surveying 504 Native Americans. Mind you, the Native American population in the United States is estimated at more than 5 million. Some of the other findings in that poll, 7 in 10 said they didn't find Redskin disrespectful to Native Americans, and 8 in 10 said they wouldn't be offended if a non-Native called them that term. Meet Rusty Whitworth. He and his wife Anita were among those polled.
I don't find it offensive or anything. It's just the way people use the word, then that becomes offensive, such as you dirty redskin or something like that. It's just a name to me.
And I believe a little differently in that I try every single day, every part of my life tries to teach my children, my grandchildren, how important it is to be Native, how important it is to embrace who we are.
There are a lot of different aspects of this story that I'm going to want to ask Mike and Ernest about, including the methodology and a sidebar that the Post published, which implies the survey could mute the mayor's call for the team to change its name before talks continue for a new stadium. But before we do, I want to read you the opening paragraph of an essay that appears on The Undefeated. That's the new ESPN platform we talked about last week. Mike Wise writes, quote, "Just because a people who have confronted institutionalized racism for centuries managed to brush off one small piece of that oppression, it doesn't mean institutionalized racism is a swell way to live." And he asks point blank the question that I want to ask both of you. Should a poll influence a moral decision?
Well, I don't think it should influence a moral decision. I read the story when it came out this weekend, and I sort of scratched my head thinking, okay, why are you writing this story? And then as I read it, I was thinking, why did you decide to take this poll? And I understand that the name of the football team and what that team represents to the city and the region is important. But I'm not sure whether or not this story actually gets to the whole point of it, which is to use the term redskin is offensive to a group of people. Now, some people within that may feel differently, but there's been a groundswell for years about this, and the way the Washington Post handled this just didn't make much sense to me.
Now, Mike, you told me earlier today you don't have much of a problem with it.
I mean, I would actually defend the way they covered the story. And first of all, any one story is not going to shed light on all of the different aspects of this piece. And the Washington Post has reported on many of those aspects for many, many years. But the thing to me is, was it a legitimate story? I think it was a legitimate story because a dozen years ago, another reputable survey outfit, the Pew Research Center, did a poll and found the same kind of results. So if you're going back a dozen years after, when so much has happened since then, when a lot of big decisions are about to be made with regard to this, is it legitimate to say, do Native Americans feel the same way they did a dozen years ago before so much coverage was done on this? I think they might have been surprised at what they found, but if 9 out of 10 Native Americans say doesn't really bother me. Is that a legitimate news story? Sure. Is it the only take on this story? No. Is it the only factor that should be considered in whether or not the team should change its name? No, but it's legitimate.
Well, I mean, part of the problem that I have with the story, they seem to couch it in the decision by the mayor and city officials to go along with the building of a new stadium and the whole controversy about the Redskin or using Redskins as a name, and what that does in terms of promoting the city and maybe a negative light. I hearken back to when they decided to change the name of the basketball team from the Washington Bullets, which is what I grew up with, to the Washington Wizards, because
of
bullets,
crime and violence.
Crime and violence, exactly. And that didn't seem to get as much attention as what's happening here with the possibility
Who's going to be pro-violence?
Exactly, with the possibility of changing the name of the Redskins. I think that the pushback that's coming from Daniel Snyder, the owner, is what's one of the things that's driving this controversy.
I mean, clearly the Post wouldn't have done the survey if it hadn't have been for the naming controversy, but it's certainly not the Post's decision to try to manage how it's going to be responded to. Of course, the team owner is going to take advantage of that survey and try to play it to their own advantage, just as other advocates who want to change the name are also going to use it as an opportunity to talk about it. The Post doesn't have to try to control the way that story is going to be perceived or decide not to do the story because somebody might take it the wrong way. I mean, the thing about that, for example, that post you mentioned from the Undefeated, I mean, a legitimate point of view, a legitimate questions to raise. But on the other hand, if you're telling me that, a white journalist somehow has privilege to tell the majority of Native Americans in this country that their opinion is not moral, I think that's also wrong.
Well, I think the other issue, Ivan, you pointed this out, was the methodology that was used. I mean, you talk about, there are an estimated 5 million Native Americans in the country. The poll only reached 504, at least 504 that they could legitimately include in the survey. The issue that I have with that is the landline issue, the fact that not many of them have landlines, many of them are on reservations that don't have the technology. That was an issue. Some decided that they didn't want to participate. That was another issue. I'm happy to see that the Washington Post, at least in their sidebar, explained how they went through the process to reach this particular number, and in some ways said it's not as representative as we would have liked it to be, but it was within the margins of error in standardized survey research. So that part I understand. Most news organizations don't do that. They don't put that much specificity into telling you how they've actually done the survey and what that means. So I think in a way the Washington Post was trying to say, we tried to do as best we could in doing this survey. So that I really appreciate. But I still have some questions about what really was the point of the story.
Well, if you want to talk about the method, I mean, I think you're right. They did a good job of spelling it out. And in fact, they answered almost all of the critics' questions. Not all of them, but almost. If you do a survey of 500 people and it's a statistically random sample, right, it can represent the opinions of 5 million people within a margin of error. Was it representative? Well, they talked about how they had to deal with the fact that most Native Americans don't have landlines. So they had a way they got around that. They used what they call weighting, which is a way to make sure that your sample matches up more with what the Census Bureau says that the population really looks like. So they did that. The only thing that I think that you can question about their method was the fact that only about 10% of the people they tried to contact in the general survey responded to it.
Right.
Now, that means 90% didn't. And is there something different about that 90% from the 10? We don't know. They argue that there's research that shows maybe it doesn't matter, but it's an open question.
I mean, I do like the point that they also that they addressed in terms of many of the people that they talked to really didn't have an opinion about it. Right. I mean, they, it was okay. They used this name for a football team. It's in my everyday life, it really doesn't matter. It doesn't put food on my table. It doesn't keep the lights on in my house. Those kinds of things. So
I also say, too, that I was surprised by the results, and I think it's still a legitimate point of view to say that that's an offensive term and a team shouldn't use that in their name. On the other hand, I think there's some journalists who are kind of conflating a couple of issues here. I mean, the writer that you mentioned, he's basically saying the majority...
The one in the Undefeated, or the one from
From the Undefeated.
Okay, because there's also a post on our blog from the Kansas City Star,
right.
So I wanted to clarify
But both
that.
of them basically making the argument, the majority isn't always right. Mm-hmm. Of course that's true. If you said the majority of Americans, if you polled them 60 years ago about civil rights, or if you polled them 10 years ago about LGBT rights, you'd have gotten a different opinion that we could say today was probably wrong. But it's one thing to say that, and it's another thing to say we talked to the group, the minority group in question, and we asked them what they thought, and they weren't offended by the phrase. That is not saying that the majority is wrong. That's saying you're questioning this minority group's right to have an opinion that differs from their leaders or from, conventional thought.
Okay, well, I know we've talked a lot about the need, in fact, I do probably almost every day, the need for more representation of women in our newsrooms, especially in the editor ranks. And I'm guessing Huffington Post executive editor Liz Herron agreed. Friday, she tweeted a photo from inside an editors meeting that said, quote, "Notice anything about this Huffington Post editors meeting?" with emojis of women dancing and arms making a muscle. In the photo, 14 women. Unclear, given the composition of that photo, how many of those 14 women are people of color. But it caught the eye of many on the internet. To quote one person on Twitter, "The only black in that room is on the second TV." There was a very thoughtful column that was published on Jet Magazine's website, which gives Huffington Post kudos, as I do, for its representation of women, but voices of people of color possibly left out in that room.
Yeah, and I think that's where a lot of the backlash came from. I mean, if you go and you read the stories that are on our blog post, and you even go into the comments of those stories, you'll see that a lot of it revolves around the fact that you didn't have any ethnic diversity within that picture. I understand where they were
or
going.
At least easily visible.
Yes, I agree. I mean, and I commend them for the point that what they're trying to do. What I would say is, let's take that a step further. Let's talk about what's in your content. What are you doing in your stories? How is that reflective of society at large?
See, and my first thought too, as I saw it, and as I was starting to read some of those responses, is this is a company that has verticals called Black Voices, called Latino Voices. How are those voices actually represented within the product and the editorial decisions made on its behalf?
I mean, it seemed to me like in some ways that picture was both refreshing and clueless at the same time. I mean, it was refreshing for the reason you said. I mean, you go into any newsroom in America, and I imagine that about 90% of the time you won't find as many women editors around the table as you saw in that table at HuffPost. So that's great. On the other hand, as we said, I mean, it wasn't very diverse. On the other hand, the Huffington Post, no one would, I think, claim that they don't try to cover issues of diversity, not only with these verticals, but from their own political philosophy as left-of-center news organization. I think they try really hard. That doesn't mean that they've succeeded, and that doesn't mean that they can't have more diverse people on their staff to do an even better job. But it's kind of ironic to me that they go out on social media and they get trashed considering the reputation that the HuffPo has.
Well, I wasn't really surprised by that. I mean, we talk about this on the program all the time. I mean, almost anything you put up, someone's going to find something negative to say about it. So when they put that up, I could see where you would start having these attacks. I mean, you had attacks about the fact that there wasn't people of color, or appeared not to have people of color in it. You had people attacking that, that they were young. That, even one comment said that, is anybody there 3 years out of college? You had, people attacking, saying, well, what about having some men there? That's diversity in and of itself.
There was also there was one tweet in response that started to get into some of those sexist issues where it just showed a bunch of cars crashing into each other, kind of insinuating that women are bad drivers. I don't know.
The thing about the sexism argument interests me because, I mean, first of all, Liz Herron kind of comes by her enthusiasm for this picture naturally. I mean, she was the social media editor at the New York Times, for example, and dealt with an awful lot of sexism and what people said about her personally, as well as about the other people that worked at the New York Times. So, I mean, being proud of the fact that she has a lot of women around that table, I think that comes naturally. But it also makes me wonder with the age issue, young women, and you have to think, well, how much are they being paid? And how much is sort of the salary imbalance being perpetuated by a company that hires people under the age of 35 to fill these ranks, and so-called pinkifying the newsroom can have perverse effects sometimes.
And that is a huge issue within corporate America that we've talked about before, but especially within the media ranks, is the inequality in pay when you talk about women and men. So I want to know, what is the standard rate of pay for those women editors as opposed to, say, the men who are actually at the even higher corporate level? Because we have some stories on our link blogs that talks about when you go up and look at the higher ranks of HuffPost, that's where you see the men. They're in charge of the purse strings. What kind of impact does that have on the actual editorial content?
Well, and you had said something a bit earlier, Mike, about the idea of Huffington Post being clearly a little bit left of center, and that idea of perhaps that going out there, it was kind of like somebody saying, well, you're always kind of picking on the people who are doing what you think is wrong. Perhaps this is our opportunity to get back at you a little bit and say, people in glass houses shouldn't throw stones. I don't know if you know this, but the Columbia Missourian's daily editorial meetings are open to the public. Anyone who wants to can head over to the 3rd floor of Lee Hills Hall every weekday at 11 o'clock and get a sense of what the paper's staff is working on. It's a level of transparency that's becoming somewhat in vogue as staffs work to engage with their audiences on a more personal level. At other places, it's done technologically, live streaming video, publishing to a news website or through social media platforms. Last week, the New York Times used Facebook Live to stream a 19-minute editorial meeting from the politics editor, Carolyn Ryan's office. Reporters Nick Correstantini, Maggie Haberman, and Thomas Kaplan pitched Ryan ideas they'd been working up, and she peppered them with questions. Let's listen to a minute or two of what that sounded like.
But we have this story about a third-party nomination for the presidency. Gary Johnson at the top of the ticket, but Bill Weld, the former governor of your state, Massachusetts, as the VP selection. And Weld gives credibility to this ticket that you might not see otherwise for people who want to support, a top of the ticket, still vote for Republicans on the Senate side, seem like they can, switch tickets and still turn out to vote. They might feel comfortable with Weld. Like he said some things to us that were intense about Trump's immigration plan.
Give me one of them.
He said that he hears the glass crunching on crystal knocked when he thinks about Trump rounding up 11 million immigrants and deporting them.
That's on the record?
Not only on the record, but unsolicited and unprompted, and just sort of said in conversation in passing as we were talking to him.
The thing that worries me is he's so quirky, quixotic even. Is this for real?
I have subtitled this segment of the program Transparency or Trainwreck because this really could have gone either way. What if that comment about Kristallnacht hadn't been on the record?
Well, that's part of the problem with putting this up online, the pitch stories, is that a lot of the information that you get there is background information. It's information that was off the record. It's sources that may not wind up in the story. But if you're putting it out there that way, you kind of open yourself up to that being considered on the record by people who are actually looking at that. And that's something that they have to be very careful about if they're going to continue to use this format.
I think you also have to worry about having routinely open sessions and live streaming those if you're talking about enterprise stories, things that are exclusive to your operation, or investigative stories. But in this particular situation, I'm pretty confident that this was well thought out ahead of time.
And I have a pretty good feeling, too, that this was really, really orchestrated. The story actually went up on the New York Times website that they're talking about pretty much instantaneously following the live stream.
I also wonder, though, if that would have gone up had there not been some news made in that meeting, which is basically that Bill Weld was comparing Donald Trump to Nazi Germany. I mean, if that hadn't been there, maybe they wouldn't have posted that video.
I mean, the whole time I was listening to it, I was kind of thinking, this sounds more like a pitch during an editorial or opinion sort of meeting as opposed to a news meeting, because they kept going in and out of what does this mean, what does that say, and that's normal in a pitch meeting, but because I think the stories were already done, they were sort of giving their opinions about what these people were saying or what they did.
That was the part that was kind of confusing to me too, is that oftentimes when I'm in a pitch meeting, the story hasn't been done yet. That's where you're getting your editor's approval, getting the green light to go into report on the story, getting the assignment made.
I mean, I do see some value in doing this from the standpoint of, we say that maybe watching the sausage being made is kind of ugly, but it's kind of useful to know, too. And journalists sometimes use shorthand or say things that they probably shouldn't say, or make assumptions about sources or the direction of a story in a meeting, where if they knew that people might be watching what they were saying, they might be a little more circumspect, but more importantly, they might approach the story somewhat differently than they do.
I do like the transparency in the way in which they did. It's almost like they're walking the viewer through how they developed the story. I think calling it a pitch meeting is not what they...
disingenuous.
I think it should be more of a post-mortem kind of thing. Okay,
so put yourself in the audience's shoes for a minute. That Facebook user, would you want to watch it? I mean, 19 minutes, it started to feel kind of boring, and I'm inside the baseball.
I wouldn't want to watch it 95% of the time, but if somebody on Twitter or Facebook or someplace pointed me to it and said, hey, something interesting came up in that conversation, and there are enough partisans or media critics watching it to identify something like that, I'd go and watch it.
Well, yeah, especially if that story came out and then somebody went back and watched it and said, wait a minute, you didn't put this in, or you put this in and really didn't talk about it, that sort of thing. I can see that coming up.
Well, we also learned today that the Times will offer voluntary buyout packages to members of the newsroom in several of its business department at month's end. Dean Baquet said in a memo today that these cuts are actually part of an aggressive growth plan.
Yeah, I mean, as we've talked about several times here, they're moving more toward digital. And in order to be able to move in that direction, they're going to have to stop doing other things. He did mention that again, and he said that over and over since he was appointed to this position. And I think this is, the second round of buyouts or potential cuts that they're going through. So I think you're starting to see some of the things that he's been talking about sort of play out, and I'll be interested to see how many are we talking about. Plus, they're still in negotiations with the Guild on a new contract, and that's all a part of this buyout as well.
Not only have they been trying to expand digital, but they've been trying to expand internationally because they see audiences there that can generate more revenue, and that's what this is really about. Even though the New York Times is relative to a lot of other legacy media doing fairly well, they still have got to generate more money. What I don't know is whether or not the buyout will be successful. The last time they tried one of these, not enough of their employees volunteered for the buyout, and so they just had to lay off some folks. So we'll see whether it works or not.
Okay, well, it's been almost 2 years since Michael Brown's shooting in the streets of Ferguson, and with that, the arrest of several journalists who had been covering the story at that time. If you'll remember, police arrested the Washington Post Wesley Lowery and the Huffington Post Ryan J. Riley at the McDonald's. It was a spot many reporters turned into a makeshift newsroom to recharge devices and file their stories. Well, St. Louis County dropped the charges against both men under the condition neither files suit against it. Riley wrote on Huffington Post following the dropping of these charges that it's a win for him, it's a win for Lowery, it's a win for their employers, but it doesn't really feel like one.
Yeah, all of those things I think are probably true. It also says something about the Huffington Post and the difference in terms of how they cover these stories and the way I'm sure the Washington Post did. Here's the headline from the Huffington Post. Prosecutors finally dropped their bogus charges against me for reporting in Ferguson. Not everyone is so lucky. I doubt that the Washington Post headline was exactly like that. Nonetheless.
And Wesley Lowery also didn't write that story about himself.
But he's right. I mean, it took them a year to file charges in St. Louis County against these journalists for just doing their jobs, and another year to decide to drop it, and only after both journalists and their publications agreed not to sue back. So I'm not sure how clear a victory it was, but the right side won.
And the other part to the story is that there are, I think, 5 other journalists who were arrested who basically filed a class action, at least their class, against St. Louis, and they settled out of court. They got monetary compensation from the county for their arrests. That didn't happen with these two journalists. So it's sort of that who actually wins in this. So I think the headline really does point out.
Well, and as Riley points out, if it hadn't been for the huge resources that the Post and HuffPo were willing to put behind their legal effort, this thing would have been settled a long time ago.
Well, here we are again, a third week into Gannett's attempt to take over Tribune Publishing, and this story just seems to get goofier by the week. Now, a second bid has been turned down, and there's a new investor in the mix.
So there's this company called Nant Capital, which is run by a billionaire from Los Angeles who's involved in medical technology, and he offered the same $15 a share as Gannett did. Of course, he was welcome into the Tribune fold, but now Gannett is thinking, well, what do? Are we going to offer more? Are we going to challenge what has been going on with the board of directors of the Tribune Company? And I still have to say, in the end, I don't know that this makes a dime's worth of difference to the kinds of journalism that those papers are going to do.
I don't think it's going to play out in terms of the type of journalism they're going to do. I mean, it's fun to watch because the guy who's saving the Tribune now wanted to buy the Los Angeles Times back a couple of years ago, and Tribune wouldn't sell it to him. So now he's coming to their rescue. I just find the whole thing fascinating.
Well, and part of it, too, is that this guy is also introducing a technological advance that is going to have some kind of a scan type thing that you can roll over a newspaper to get other content, which frankly it sounds like a QR code that's really like a decade-old technology.
Oh, it's a 20-year-old technology, and I can't understand for the life of me why they're even thinking about this. It didn't work the last time. I don't think it's going to work here.
It just seems more like an issue of control for Michael Farrow, the current CEO, and not a matter of serving shareholder or public interest that much.
I think a lot of it is that they just don't want to be, if they're going to be bought out, it needs to be somebody else other than Gannett. Exactly.
They just don't want to be Gannett. Quickly before we go, there is another soap opera of sorts that's going on behind the scenes in the media world. The control of Viacom is up in the air.
Yeah, and there's a lot of big brands there. I mean, think about MTV, Comedy Central, Nickelodeon,
CBS.
Paramount Pictures, right? And it all revolves around whether Sumner Redstone, who's run that company forever, is legally competent. He's 92 years old. Some say he's not competent, that his daughter is somehow manipulating him.
Who was estranged at one point.
Right. So, I mean, again, I don't know if it matters to the public in terms of what's going to happen with the content on those channels, but there are brands that we recognize, and so people are interested in it.
Yeah. It's a really strange thing. I mean, it's one of those soap operas that only plays out for the very, very rich, the top 1%. So that's basically what happened is you got people trying to control a huge empire.
Okay, well, we are just about out of time for today. I'd like to thank you for spending the last half hour with us. You can read more about the topics we talked about on today's program. Check out our links blog under the Programs tab at KBIA.org. We also ask you to like us on Facebook or follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @ViewsOnKBIA. These are all great ways to watch and listen to our program again, leave us comments or questions, see previews of what we'll be talking about next week, and more. I'd like to give our thanks to RJI's Travis McMillan for directing today's show, and to Pat Akers for handling the audio. I'm Amy Simons. Be sure to join us again next week when we're back with you for another edition of Views of the News.